That's pretty cool. That's pretty good. And with evidence like that, it leaves me no doubt that what we have is intact. The source itself has remained intact over these years, so that gives me hope. That helps me understand that I trust the source. I also find out that the sources are consistent. The sources are consistent. If the Bible were a lie, I'd expect less congruency. After all, the source is a group of 40 different authors who wrote 66 books over a span of 1,500 years in 3 continents, in 3 different languages, in multiple genres. Such a book, such a collection should have multiple discrepancies, should have a lot of inconsistencies, contradictions along the way. And yet when I look at the Bible and I read through it, there's no such problem. And consider this. You look back at the Old Testament, you see the Old Testament book of Kings and the Old Testament books of Chronicles, and you read through them and you see them talking about the same time period. You see them talking about the same people, and the stories that I see in Kings match up with what I see in Chronicles. I go to the New Testament and I see 4 separate accounts of the life and death and ministry of Christ and the resurrection. And I see 4 copies here that we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I read through them, and yeah, some of them provide some different perspectives. But just like any other group of eyewitnesses, they have different perspectives. They might share different details, but they all come together. They all harmonize. They all harmonize. We even find consistency between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The principles that we find in the Old Testament line up with what we see in the New Testament. The description of God that we find back there, this holy and just and loving and merciful God from the Old Testament, is still the holy and just and loving and merciful God that we find in the New Testament. The sources are consistent, and the more that I read the Bible, the more amazed I am at how consistent those teachings are. The sources seem trustworthy. I also look at this and say the sources don't benefit. If I'm trying to decide if I trust a source, I want to look and say, are these sources benefiting from it? Do they have anything personal to gain from it? If it were a lie, I'd expect the Bible to be a whole lot more self-serving to its authors. But instead, I find it to be very unflattering to its authors. Paul, as he's writing some letters, says that he is the chief of sinners. Woo! That's great when you're trying to write to a church crowd, right? The chief of sinners. Matthew, one of the disciples, records how, when he's talking about his experiences with Jesus, how he and the other disciples were clueless. Jesus is teaching, and they're just sitting there. Could you explain that? It's not very flattering. I'd like to at least, make myself sound a little bit better, but they're not trying to do that at all. I find that the authors, for the most part, are anonymous. They write these books, and they're not trying to get any credit for themselves. Tradition tells us a lot of the authors that we find, but some of them, we still don't even know who wrote the book of Hebrews, for sure. They're not trying to gain anything from writing these things. They're not trying to gain credit from this. I find also that the authors suffered as they're writing this material. It's one thing to be skewered by critics. It's another to experience what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. Mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They died by the sword. Paul himself describes his experiences in 2 Corinthians and says how he was beaten, lashed, stoned, and shipwrecked because of this message that he's written down, that he's preached. You don't face that kind of persecution unless you're really convinced of your message. The sources are not benefiting from this, and based on that, it seems trustworthy. Do I trust the source? Yeah, the source seems trustworthy. That's an everyday test of truth that we see here that says the Bible in its past truth is correct. There's another test. Okay, let's keep going. The story. Let's talk about the story. Is the story believable? This is another everyday test of truth that we face. And it got me thinking about my son, Jacob. Jacob is 7 years old, and he's full of energy, got a lot of stuff going on there, but he's losing teeth. Typical kid thing to do here. He's missing his 2 front teeth there. And he was excited when he lost his first tooth last year because he was going to go put it under his pillow for the tooth fairy. Okay? He's excited about this. And he puts it under there. And I'm not a bad parent. I'm really not. But every now and then I'm forgetful. And I went to bed that night, and I woke up the next morning, and as I sat there, it just hit me like a bolt of lightning. Oh my goodness, the tooth's still under the pillow, and I didn't put any money there. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling the message. Tooth fairy, not real. Sorry. But I realized I hadn't put any money under his pillow, so I'm like, okay, he's still asleep. I can do this. I go grab some quarters. I sneak into his room all ninja-like. Okay, I get there. I get it under his pillow. I slide it in underneath. Everything's good. I just got to get that tooth. I'm feeling around. I can't find the tooth. Okay? I'm probing, and and all of a sudden Jacob wakes up. And he turns around, he's like, Dad, what are you doing? And I thought quickly, and I said, buddy, I was so excited to see what the tooth fairy would bring, I just couldn't wait. So I pulled the pillow back, and we marveled that the tooth fairy left him some money, and she even left the tooth so we could save it as a keepsake. What an awesome tooth fairy it was. Oh, kids are so gullible. You gotta love it. And my point is, they can hear the silliest stories and believe them. Now, we're not going to get into the morality of me telling such an obvious lie. That's for another conference. But the issue here is believability. Believability. And for that, we have to focus on the everyday test of truth. I believe some things because they sound realistic. There's just that ring of truth to it when I hear the story. The story seems to match the things that I've seen in real life. The details are convincing enough. And in everyday life, I decide if a story is believable. And so I wonder, what happens when I apply this test to the Bible? What happens when I apply this test to the Bible? Does it show me that the Bible is faithful for the past? And here I'm going to have to say, yeah, it does. Consider the following things. The details of the Bible stories fit known history. If it were a lie, I'd expect the Bible to be filled with made-up facts along the way, but historical and archaeological evidence verifies much of what we see in the Bible. It contains real people. The existence of these people groups that it describes are out there. People from the Hittites to the Romans were real people. The leaders it discusses, Cyrus, Nebuchadnezzar, Caesar, Augustus, Pontius Pilate, they're all real people. We can document that. So they're real. It has real places. You go to Israel today, you can find Jericho and Jerusalem and the Jordan River and these places that are in actual existence. It's not talking about Narnia or Hogwarts or Oz. This is real stuff. These are real places. And they're real events that happened. While not everything in life gets recorded for posterity, I mean, we won't know what you got for your birthday in 500 years, okay? But a lot of the major things do get recorded. And we look through and we see details in the Bible corresponding. We see the capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. It happened. It matches up. The expulsion of Christians and Jews from the city of Rome in 49 AD with the Edict of Claudius. It talks about it in the Bible. History backs it up. It happened. Those things match up. The details make the story believable. We do a little bit more digging and we find out the characters are all too human. When we start looking through the Bible, if this were false, I'd expect the people it describes to be too good to be true, at least when it's talking about the heroes along the way. But much like the authors who weren't too interested in self-promotion, we find out that the Bible is not too interested in putting an inflated view of its subject matter out there. The characters are believable guys. King David, hero. One guy that we look to and say, this was a man of God, he was a great guy, and yet it also talks about him being an adulterer, and he arranged a murder. These are not usually qualities you want out of a hero, but there they are for us to see. Abraham, the father of our faith, and yet it talks about how he's out there lying to protect his own skin. We see other stories out there. Paul, one of the most influential Christians to live, starts off the story as a strict persecutor of Christians. He approves the death and imprisonment of those who believe in a resurrected Christ. This is not exactly the picture of a guy that we'd want out there. But the Bible shares it. The characters are way too human. The people are believable along the way. We also find out that the story has authentic detail. Believable stories have believable details. Stuff that you would have no reason to make up. And there's just plenty of stuff in the Bible that they would have no reason to make up the way they do it. In John 21:11, it talks about a fishing incident involving Jesus, and it just throws in the detail that the boys caught 153 fish in the net. Okay? 153 fish. Why would you make that up? It's just there. 1 Chronicles 27:30 talks about the fact that Obil the Ishmaelite was in charge of King David's camels, and Jediah the Meronothite was in charge of the donkeys. And we care why? Who would make that up? It seems like an insignificant detail, but there it is. In the final chapter of Colossians, Paul passes on greetings from random people like Aristarchus, Epaphras, Demas, and Justus, people that we don't know anything about. We don't know much about these guys. If they're making this stuff up, wouldn't we want to include, influential people? Peter says hi. Jesus says hi. Who's Justus? Who's Demas? Who's this guy taking care of the camels and the donkeys? Nobody cares about them. Why include it unless it's true? This stuff helps me realize that the story itself is believable. And I will throw out this disclaimer. Asking, is the story believable, can be hard for a book that talks about the miraculous, that talks about virgin births and arks and floods and resurrections. If the whole thing were just a bunch of superstitious stuff along the way, like Greek mythology, with fictitious characters and places and events, then okay, it would be fine to dismiss it. But the fact that the authors are so credible on their details, matching history, giving us realistic humans, and sharing details that no one makes up, that makes it easier for us to say, you know what, I think they're telling the truth. I don't think they're making this up along the way. And if the storyline is about a God who interjects himself into history, then this could actually be plausible. So based on the story, the Bible seems trustworthy. Do I trust it? Yeah, I do. Well, the final everyday test of past truth has to do with facts. We start looking at facts here and say, do the facts line up? Do the facts line up? Now, here's a fact. Here's a fact for you. Donald Trump is a success. Donald Trump is a successful businessman. I believe that, even though there are still some things that puzzle me. I struggle with the fact that his enterprises have been involved in multiple bankruptcies. But most of all, I wonder how someone so powerful could have such bad hair. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, really, look at that. That's just scary. It's not right. But it comes down to one argument. If I say, I believe this, I believe that he's a successful businessman, I have to reconcile it with the fact of that hair. Okay? And I believe some things because I use logic. Okay? Now, on the bankruptcy issue, logic says that Trump has been able to separate his personal and his corporate finances, and so even though his company has had issues personally, he's been able to maintain a vast income, and so he can be a successful businessman in terms of those results. Okay, logic says I can figure that out. On the hair issue, logic says that bad hair is a luxury you can afford if you're good at your job. Justin Bieber, Tom Brady, I'm just saying. Bad hair is a luxury you can afford. Logic tells me that. And my point in life, my point is that in everyday life we face conflicting information that we have to make sense of. And by using logic, we can reconcile these problems and say, okay, I think I figured out the truth. We can see that logic says riding on an airplane is pretty safe, even though that I know some people have died doing it. I can say that texting while driving is not a safe thing to do, even though yet I've avoided a crash. Okay? Logic helps us see that if the facts line up enough for us to believe, then that tells us it's true. So what happens when we apply this to the Bible? When I start thinking about using logic here and figuring out the facts, I find out some different things. First of all, I'd say that the inaccuracies that we find in the Bible really aren't so inaccurate. Skeptics love to look at the Bible and point out that it simply has the facts wrong. And they say if they can't get the simple stuff straight, if they can't get these things right, then why worry about the bigger things? Why worry about the theology? But if we view it properly, these inaccuracies can be easily explained. Let me give you an example. Out of 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 23, skeptics like to point out that the dimensions that they list in 1 Kings 7 of this basin, okay, there's a round basin. They like to point out that the dimensions just don't match up. It's got a diameter of 10 and a circumference of 30, and if you calculate this out, then the value of pi has to equal 3, except we know that pi does not equal 3. Pi equals 3.14 and all sorts of decimal points. And see, it's inaccurate. The Bible's wrong. They can't do that. And we can look at that and say, okay, that's true. It doesn't match up exactly, but that's expecting a level of scientific precision that most of us don't use. If somebody asks you how much money you made last year, and you round it off to the nearest $10,000, Are you lying? Are you inaccurate?